What you're about to listen to is part 2 of our ongoing series, Ends of the Earth. In it, we explore the triumphs and tragedies surrounding the exploration of the Earth's poles for trade, conquest, and glory. If you haven't already listened to our first episode, the Coppermine Expedition, I would highly encourage you to do so, as it provides important background information you will want to know before continuing the story. If you're familiar with the subject matter, already listened to part 1, or just want to continue, then welcome back to Grisly History. Where we last left off, Sir John Franklin and his expedition stopped for the winter several hundred miles short of the Arctic coast. Here, Franklin was joined by a band of Yellowknife hunters, part of the native Dene people, who were recruited by Franklin to assist in the expedition, and who had just convinced Franklin that stopping for another winter was necessary to survival. Also accompanying the expedition, aside from the English, were French voyageurs, as well as hired hands from Orkney that had been picked up before a transatlantic voyage. It was a small, battered group, having already traversed thousands of miles across the Canadian wilderness for 2 years. Their hope and prayer was that in the next year, they would find themselves traversing the northern coast of Canada, just south of the Arctic archipelago, where absolution would come in the form of Captain William Parry. Parry had been traversing the northern reaches of Canada by sea, while Franklin and his expedition had traveled by foot. Come spring and summer of 1821, those in the Franklin expedition hoped to link up with Parry and his boat along the coast, where they could sail back to England as heroes and discoverers of the Northwest Passage. Unfortunately for Franklin and his men, Parry would not be waiting by boat to take Franklin's party away from these barren lands, and without Parry, there was only one way back home. Soon enough for the men of the Coppermine Expedition, illusions of grandeur would give way to exhaustion, desperation, and eventually, survival itself. They were now just 3 degrees below the Arctic Circle, and they rarely saw sunlight. Fortunately for the group, it was the mildest winter in Yellowknife memory that year, though that isn't to say that they had pleasant weather. The lowest temperature hit negative 57 degrees below zero, and in January and February of 1821, the thermometer never went above zero at all. The sun would appear, not so much rise, but appear around 11:20 a.m. before descending again around 2:30 p.m. Much of their light came from the stars in the aurora borealis, which was actually part of what the expedition came to explore. You see, when the aurora borealis appears, it tends to make the needle of a compass dip due to its relationship with the magnetic field. Throughout the winter, the officers tried to pass the time studying this effect, but drew no real conclusions from it. Time passed slowly at Fort Enterprise, and from looking at the journals, one gets the sense that almost everyone suffered from boredom and melancholy that winter. The Yellowknives did not actually stay in the fort, but built their own encampment nearby. They did, however, allow an older guide, 2 women, and 2 teenage girls to stay at the fort for reasons I'm uncertain of. This led to the most interesting bit of drama that winter, when midshipmen's Hood and Back both took a liking to one of the girls, who they all affectionately referred to as Greenstockings. There's not much of substance written about this love triangle, and in fact, Franklin wrote nothing about it at all, probably for the same reason he didn't write about the near mutiny he had. But according to seaman John Hepburn's later writings about the expedition, both men jealously sought the 15 or 16-year-old's affection. Their rivalry became so intense that they finally proposed a duel for her. Fortunately, someone sensibly removed the bullets from their guns, but it was apparent that matters couldn't go on this way. So it was that in October, Back offered to return south with some of the voyageurs and their wives, ostensibly to fetch supplies, but also to remove himself from the Greenstockings equation. As soon as he was off, Hood took her to bed for the rest of the winter. Not much else is known about her as they left her behind on the Arctic coast the following summer. It is further uncertain if Hood ever knew that he had impregnated her. The rest of the winter was spent with Hood composing maps, and Richardson illustrating and writing of the various flora and fauna they encountered on their journey. He would go on to compose a 4-volume set published in 1829, making it one of the most conclusive works on native species in Canada at the time. As the men in the fort busied themselves with their writings, George Back's party endured a brutal journey through winter's icy heart. Matters were actually becoming quite dire, if, as you remember me mentioning, the earlier winter they had only a little flour, arrowroot, and condensed soup, supplemented by the caribou that had been slain in August. On top of that, they were now nearly out of bullets and powder for their rifles, so someone had to make the dangerous trek south if they were to continue. Back left October 18th with the Northwest Company representative Willard Wenzel, 2 voyageurs, 2 native hunters, and their wives, bound for Fort Providence to once again ask for their supplies. The ground was rocky and slippery as snow and ice covered almost every surface, and there were dozens of lakes that had to be trekked around because their icy surface was too thin to walk on. There were a few times where there was no food to be had for a day or two at a time, and whenever there was, it was given to the Europeans, for, as one of the natives said, "We are accustomed to starvation, you are not." By November, they were out of bullets, and so they had to begin melting down pewter mugs for shot. Finally, on November 2nd, they made it to the fort, and to their great relief, some of their supplies had actually made it. This relief quickly transformed to distaste when they realized that of the 16 crates, very few of them were actually useful. These crates included flour, sugar, 3 kegs of watered-down rum, a roll of tobacco, and 40 pounds of ammunition. Knowing that this was not nearly enough, Back embarked on a 5-month journey, walking 1,100 miles from trading post to trading post until he finally got enough supplies to see them through their journey to the coast. As winter in the far north began to draw to a close in 1821, Franklin prepared to once again meet with Acacho and once again secure a commitment from him to hunt and travel with the expedition. He had sent letters to John Barrow and others when George Back had gone south, requesting that they honor the promises that he made to the Yellowknives of ammunition and metal. I won't go into details, but in the end, Franklin had overpromised what they would actually receive. Once Back returned to camp, Franklin pondered over how much to offer Acacho, knowing that too much could imperil their own journey along the Arctic coast, but too little could offend the Yellowknife leader. Franklin wound up doing the latter, and so when he met, he gave Acacho a keg of rum, smaller than was customary, no cloth to clothe his people, and no supplies to bring back home, as he was saving some to trade with the Inuit, who were again mortal enemies of the Yellowknives. Acacho told him that this would not do, and a little while later about 120 Yellowknives arrived and made camp, leading Franklin to reluctantly offer more supplies to him. This left the English feeling that the natives were fickle and untrustworthy, and remained suspicious of them throughout the rest of the expedition. For what it's worth, Acacho had to get the best deal possible, because his leadership in the band did not come by heritage, but it was actually based upon one's ability to lead. So, to remain in charge, there was always a burden to prove himself. Nevertheless, the deal proved acceptable, and once again, Acacho promised to hunt and defend the party as they traveled up the river. The party began making preparations for their journey in May, and there was work to be done before any progress could be made. In particular, the bark canoes had to be mended with tree gum as they had all cracked in the unimaginable cold of that winter. When they left on June 4th, 1821, it was still actually winter, but there was enough of a thaw to make it possible to walk and sledge. Let me say a brief word here about man-hauling a sledge. If you don't know what that is, think about what a dog sled looks like, with dogs in individual harnesses pulling a sled 2 or 3 times their size and several times heavier than their own weight. So now imagine that, but with people in the harnesses. When you pull one of these, and I actually had the displeasure of doing this one weekend at a scout jamboree, you have to do so with everyone giving an equal effort. This is because if you're not moving in a rhythm, it will cause the sledge to move unevenly. And if you're at the back, then that means it's going to hit the back of your calves. It is hard work that will have the harness pinching your nerves and wearing out the skin underneath your several layers of clothes. And speaking of those clothes, all of that wool that you would be wearing to keep warm in the below freezing weather would gradually begin to work against you as you would start to sweat from the exertion, leaving it to stick to your skin and periodically freeze, only to make you colder. Imagine doing that in shifts all day long and laying down to bed on frozen, rocky ground, only to turn around and do it all again the next day and the day after that for months because your very survival depends on it. Well, misery began their first night out. They passed above the tree line, the point at which trees stop growing because the weather will not support them, and brought no fuel for a fire, leaving them all so cold that night that they couldn't even sleep. As the weather got warmer, the mosquitoes once again hatched and immediately began tormenting them, despite covering almost all of their exposed skin. To make matters worse, as the thaw came on, everything began to get muddy, causing their feet and ankles to freeze with each step. The ice, however, was not totally thawed. As they cut their path, they came across sharp edges that would cut open their ankles. The Yellowknives' dogs suffered the worst than anyone, as they left behind bloody paw prints with each step by the time they reached the coast. There was also too much ice left on the lakes that they passed to use the canoes, so they would have to haul their gear around for additional miles just to get around them. Now, above the tree line, the only sort of flora you will find are grasses, lichen, and small bushes. Caribou feed on these, but the party saw very few of them on their trip. Still, they needed to eat about one a day to stay fed, but the hunters rarely bagged that, leaving them to try and slake their hunger some days with an herbal tea enjoyed by some of the natives in the region. Once the river emerged from the maze of lakes, it was dangerous. When they began in mid-July, the water was no longer frozen, but rapids and shoals were still numerous. There were also chunks of ice floating down the river that they had to contend with along with the usual rocks. At one point, they killed a grizzly, which the Canadians and Europeans ate, but the Indians didn't because they considered grizzly meat tainted. Finally, after having traveled for more than a month and having gone hundreds of wet, rocky miles, on July 13th, they reached a place called Bloody Falls, and many of the Yellowknives declared that they would go no further. Memories are long in the north, and these falls were named after a massacre some 50 years ago when a group of Dene had set upon a camp of Inuit, killing 20 men, women, and children. This was considered the beginning of Inuit country, and as far as Acacia was concerned, he had held up his end of the bargain. But he agreed to continue with the expedition with a small group of hunters until they could finally find some friendly Inuit that could help them along the coast. The group had 2 Inuit guides with them, who were instructed to look for bands of Inuit close to the Coppermine Delta that would trade food for metal, a most rare and valuable commodity in the Arctic. The guides went forth and came upon a lodge of Inuit who were unarmed. The guides showed them gifts and said that white people were coming with more, but rather than entice them, this made the Inuit flee, leaving their possessions behind. On July 16th, with the guides in the lead, the group came upon another clan who, like the previous, took flight at the mere sight of their coming. Some of the men from the group ran ahead and managed to catch an old man and brought him back to the Inuit camp. When the guides asked him why the group had run from them, the old man reported that his people had never seen whites before, but they had heard such stories as to make them flee in fear. The guide set about trying to assuage the old man's fears and took out some well-crafted ice picks and demonstrated how his people could use them once winter returned. This greatly impressed him, and he agreed to go and find his clan, that he might convince some of the young men to return and negotiate with them. However, once he left, he was never seen again, and presumably his group moved on. The camp was an eerie sight, as the men reported seeing bones and skulls strewn along the ground. This was likely due to the fact that the ground this far north was too frozen and rocky to bury the dead. Whatever the reason, it made Acacio nervous, and he didn't care for the prospects of finding friendly Inuit. Fearful of being surrounded, he took his remaining people and left the group the following day. The day after that, July 18th, the expedition reached the coast, and 4 voyageurs and a Hudson's Bay Company man turned back to catch up with the Yellowknives, believing that they would neither be able to find enough food nor friendly Inuit, both of which would be necessary to carry out the expedition's objectives. The party was now down to 20, and troubles were piling up fast. On the coast, they were not only above the tree line, but the grass line, meaning the only flora to be found were the lichen that grew upon the rocks. Without Inuit to trade meat and blubber with, as well as to give them directions along the coast, their chances of survival were dubious at best. Despite these dire prospects, Franklin and the other officers were nearly ecstatic to be on the coast. It had taken 2 years, and once again they believed that by canoeing east, they would reach Captain Perry's ship and be back in Hudson Bay within a month or two. By this point, midsummer of 1821, Perry was blocked by gigantic walls of ice somewhere near what would go on to become known as the Fury and Helica Strait. This was more than 750 miles or 1,200 kilometers from the Coppermine Delta, so suffice to say, there's never any real chance of the two parties meeting up. Nevertheless, hopes were high among the expedition's leaders, and with roughly 2 months before winter set in, they ordered the men into the canoes and put off to sea eastward. The first day out, they made it 30 miles along the barren coast. They sat low in their canoes, and with Arctic fog enveloping them, they had a difficult time reckoning where they were. They named positively everything they saw after themselves and their benefactors, though they often did so erroneously, as due to the fog, lands were often in fact islands, and waterways were either much larger or smaller than they appeared. Nevertheless, part of their job was to map the coast, and they gave it their best effort. As you may imagine, canoeing in the ocean is very hard work and leaves a rower quite hungry. Throughout July, the party built up quite a calorie deficit, as the few supplies they had left characteristically ran low. They saw no Inuit that month, and the metal and trinkets they had brought with them to trade increasingly became an unwelcome burden. With the hunters gone, the men did what they could to find game in the foggy, barren landscape. There was no grass along the coast, which meant that there were no groups of caribou. Though they did from time to time spy a lone caribou, it always seemed to be just out of reach of their muskets. So they took to hunting polar bears to supplement their rapidly decreasing pemmican and dried meat. According to their journals, the bears they were able to shoot were so lean that they thought them diseased. By early August, the weather had begun to grow noticeably colder, and the men were eager to reach Hudson Bay, thinking that after 3 weeks on the water they must be getting close. As the waters grew more tumultuous, they began to notice the land to their north, and thought that it must be a large island. However, they were mistaken. They had just sailed into an inlet that they would go on to name Melville Sound. They had reached a dead end. With ocean waves damaging the canoes, food running dangerously low, and winter settling in, some of the officers began to entreat Franklin to turn back so they might be able to reach Fort Enterprise before the big freeze. Franklin resisted this notion, as other explorers had ruined their chances of obtaining future expeditions by not going far enough, and so far this expedition had made no major discoveries. On August 15th, a storm drove them ashore, and after 3 days of unrelenting rain, Franklin was forced to concede that they were in serious danger of being caught out in the wilderness at winter's onset, and so he ordered the expedition to turn around. In all, they had traveled 550 miles, and filled in more of the coastline and northern islands on the blank spots of Canada's map. Still, much of the map remained blank for years, and Franklin likely never realized that the expedition had only made it about a fifth of the way to Hudson Bay. And had he been more well-provisioned, or if they would have found friendly Inuit to trade with to keep the party going, his hubris might very well have led them to freeze to death somewhere along the Arctic coast. On August 20th, 2 days after they set back, the group was down to their last bag of pemmican, which might last them 3 days at best. The geese were beginning to fly south, and the caribou retreated back toward the tree line. The only game they found on the coast was an Arctic fox that served as dinner one night. By the 24th, they reached the mouth of the Hood River, named for, you guessed it, one Officer Robert Hood, which put them 200 miles directly north of Fort Enterprise. However, they could not travel in a straight line, as that would see them passing through an entirely unmapped and unknown region now that the Yellowknives had left the party. Instead, they would have to travel back the way they had come. The group took a week to pause and repair their canoes, which had taken quite a beating out on the sea. As the men mended the bark, they began to take stock of their situation. Worsening weather, no wood for a fire, and the increasing uncertainty of finding food. It wasn't looking good. Even the voyageurs were starting to weigh the natives' words about how they were accustomed to starving, but the whites were not. They needed to make this journey as quickly as possible, as their only chance of survival was to get back to the warmth and safety of Fort Enterprise, as well as the game the Yellowknives had been killing for the coming winter. They started back on August 31st, with the men carrying the canoes on their backs until they came to rivers or lakes to use them. The wind was growing stronger, and those carrying the canoes often found themselves being picked up and knocked back down by it. The wind was constant, causing their tents to collapse in the night, and gradually the incessant rain began to turn to snow. For their first 3 days out, they were able to shoot enough game to keep themselves fed. But by September the 4th, they finally ate the last of their pemmican, and on the 5th, their food stores ran out completely. It was also on the 5th that a great storm blew in, one so ferocious that they were unable to continue for 3 days. During that storm, the thermometer first dipped below 0, and once it relented, the men found that they could barely pick themselves up, let alone all of their gear, after going hungry for 3 days. Franklin himself actually fainted shortly after starting again, and was only revived by a bit of frozen soup as they could not light a fire. Game remained scarce for the next week, and the men's progress grew slower as a result of malnutrition and the gradual freezing of the rivers and lakes. Slowly, they began to shed things that were not essential to survival. Trinkets and medals they had intended to trade at first, but then on the 13th, they reluctantly left all of their scientific instruments behind. On the 14th, a voyageur named Perrault surprised everyone when he passed out a piece of food to each man after having hidden away some in his provisions. The officers were so grateful they wept, and this is one of the only times that Franklin recalled any of the voyageurs by name in his writings. However, that same day, the canoe that Franklin was in capsized, leaving him stranded ashore and alone as the other canoes rescued the drowning men downriver. There, on the bank, watching his men, as well as all of his notebooks and astrological records drift downstream, he lost his confidence in the expedition and forced himself to suppress the terror that they wouldn't all die before reaching Fort Enterprise. It was at this point that the men took to eating the only thing left available to them, a thin soup made from lichen that they called tripe de roche. As you may imagine, eating cold moss is very unpleasant. I read one description that said it has the texture of soft fabric, and Franklin describes tripe de roche in his journal like this, quote, "The tripe de roche, even where we got enough, only served to allay the pangs of hunger for a short time. This unpalatable weed was now quite nauseous to the whole party, and in several it produced bowel complaints. Mr. Hood was the greatest sufferer from this cause." Unquote. Lawrence Millman, an author and micrologist, opines that these bowel complaints may have been the cause of not boiling the lichen properly, because lichen contains an enzyme that can dissolve the outermost layer of a rock. Nevertheless, from here on out, the group ate tripe de roche whenever they could find it, and when they could not find it, they tried to assuage their hunger with herbal tea. Progress slowed to a crawl on the 21st, as Richardson was forced to leave behind the plant samples that he had laboriously gathered from the coast. Remember the constant wind I mentioned? Well, it continued right along, picking up and throwing down the canoes and the men carrying them. The men begged Franklin to let them abandon them, as the incessant abuse was hampering and hurting them, but he insisted that they would need them even into the next year. This all took its toll, and gradually all of the canoes were ruined, with the last one being destroyed on September 24th. Franklin was infuriated with the voyageurs for letting this happen, and he was convinced that they had damaged them on purpose so that they wouldn't have to keep carrying them. But the next day they had a tremendous stroke of good fortune, in which they came upon a herd of caribou migrating south and managed to kill 5 of them. When they finally had their first real meal in 2 weeks, it made their shrunken stomachs sick. Still, it brought them some much-needed energy and morale as they continued through the thickening snow. They marched on for 2 days until they reached their biggest obstacle yet, a river 120 yards wide. As they stood on the river bank staring into the waters before them, it became apparent that they had no way to cross it. Here it was, September 27th, and winter was now upon them, and Fort Enterprise lay only 40 miles away. They considered the problem for days. A thinner place to ford could be 30 or 40 miles away in either direction, and they had neither the time nor energy to waste if they failed to find a crossing. Further compounding the problem was the fact that they were still miles above the tree line, so they had no way to fashion a proper raft to ferry them over. During these days, Franklin's journal is filled with a flurry of scathing entries in which he imagined that the voyageurs must be deeply lamenting the loss of the canoes which he insisted that they had purposely broken, and wildly speculated that they had stolen food and were now hiding it from the officers. He wrote that there was no doubt that the officers were now suffering the greatest of all because they were less accustomed to robust habit and privation. The men began to set into a constant state of irritation, and as George Back noted in his journal, there is little compassion in the human frame when it is in a state of privation. They came to call this place Obstruction Rapids, and as the thermometer dipped ever lower, they began to wonder if it would be their final resting place. Franklin offered a reward to the first man to make his way across, and so every man set about looking for any means to do it. The first idea was to make use of the river willows that grew along the bank. These willows were not very large at all, perhaps the size of a small bush, but the voyageurs managed to weave their green branches together and build a small raft. The plan, then, was for someone to row to the other side with a rope, by which they could use a pulley to bring themselves over one at a time. Twice they tried to make the crossing with their one remaining oar, but a strong wind kept blowing the raft back to shore. As they had gathered the branches that day, they came across the body of a dead caribou, which had evidently fallen from a cliff, and they were so desperate for nutrition that they ate its rancid meat. In an act of incredible bravery, John Richardson, second in overall command of the expedition, volunteered to swim to the other side with a rope tied to his waist. I'm going to quote from Anthony Brandt's incredible book, The Man Who Ate His Shoes, The History and Search of the Northwest Passage. It is an engaging and immensely informative book that I would recommend to anyone who wants to dive deeper into this topic. But Brandt writes this about Richardson's attempt to cross the river. He tied the line around his waist and dove in. He soon lost the use of his arms to the cold, so he turned over and tried to propel himself with his legs. He got almost the whole way over before he sank out of sight. They hauled him back, wrapped him in blankets, and thawed him out, but it was hours before he could speak again. Franklin says that they all stared at his naked body, amazed to see how skeletal he had become. They had all become skeletal. They were all weak. The body eats itself when it's starving, eating muscle, even heart muscle. They were as weak as children now. They made a stronger raft and again attempted the crossing, but the wind blew them back as it had before. As the days wore on, the snow became thicker, and the men resorted to sucking the marrow from the bones of the dead caribou. On the 29th of September, the two Inuit that had served as the party's guides and interpreters wandered off from the camp. The younger was never seen again, and in all probability was the first to die. However, the older one, Saint Germain, had made his own camp and crafted another raft that he brought back to the group on October the 4th. After a week, the wind finally relented enough for them to make it across with the rope, and one by one, they made the crossing. By this point, the men were moving in slow motion from starvation, delirium, and hypothermia. They were so desperate for food that they supplemented their tripe de roche with scorched bits of leather. This is how Franklin earned his nickname, with the men taking old boots and stripping them down before holding the tatters over a fire and gnawing on them. They were so weak that the officers didn't know if they even had the strength to make it the last 40 miles to Fort Enterprise. So Franklin ordered George Back to take Saint Germain and the two strongest voyageurs ahead of the party to rouse the Yellowknives and bring food back to them as they plodded along. Back left on October the 5th, and as the rest of the party continued south, two of the voyageurs fell more than a mile behind. Richardson went back to bring them to the group, but he could only find one. The man he found was so weak that he was falling down with nearly every step, despite Richardson walking beside him and shouting encouragement. He was dead before the day was over. The death toll now stood at 3. After this, Franklin was firmly convinced that they would not make it to Fort Enterprise without immediate aid. He talked the matter over with the other officers, and they agreed to split the party in half once they reached the wood line. They reached the woods 2 days later on October the 7th and announced the plan to the men. Franklin would go ahead with the 9 strongest voyageurs, while Hood, Hepburn, and Richardson remained behind with the weaker men. The day they set out, they made 5 miles, but immediately ran into problems when 2 of the voyageurs were obviously too weak to continue and turned back for Richardson's camp. The next day, 2 more did the same. However, only one of those 4 men made it back, a half-native, half-Canadian named Michael Terre Haute. Terre Haute returned to a dismal scene. The camp was gradually falling to shambles as his demoralized countrymen had grown too weak to attend to basic camp duties. The voyageurs became so feeble as to be unable to leave their tents, leaving the Englishmen to see to basic camp tasks and to care for the others. So it came as a great relief to them that someone strong had returned to camp. In fact, Terre Haute raised morale a bit when he presented the party with a portion of meat. Meat, he claimed, came from a dead wolf that had evidently been gored by a caribou. The story and the meat was strange to the men, but none of them had ever eaten a wolf before, and as hungry as they were grateful for whatever they could get. Over the course of the next week, the voyageurs grew too frail to do anything for themselves, leading the Englishmen to tend to their every need. When they found the strength to do so, they ventured a little ways out of the camp to gather firewood and to set snares in the vain hope of catching something and regaining their strength. They asked Terre Haute to help them, but he grew increasingly aloof, often becoming short with the others and wandering off into the woods beyond camp, sometimes returning hours later. One by one, the voyageurs either died from starvation or slipped off into the woods, never to be seen again, all except for Terre Haute, who never seemed to grow tired and never seemed to lose his strength. What Terre Haute did seem to be losing was his sanity. As more men died, he made increasingly bizarre comments and was given over to explosive bouts of shouting or weeping. His erratic behavior reached a sudden crescendo on the afternoon of October 20th, when a gunshot rang out from the tent. Richardson had been off searching for lichen and ran back to camp, meeting Hepburn and pushing open the tent flaps to find a grisly scene. Lying face down on the floor was Robert Hood, with a bullet wound to the back of his head. Standing over him with a musket was Michael Terre Haute. Stunned and at a loss for words, the Englishmen listened as Terre Haute told them that Hood had committed suicide. He then began to ask them, with a frantic look in his eyes, if they believed him, to which, unsure of what else to say, they said yes. Throughout the rest of the day, when speaking of Hood's death, the men never implicated Terre Haute directly. It was apparent to both Hepburn and Richardson that he was stronger than both of them, and at all times he carried 2 pistols, a bayonet, and a knife. Terre Haute grew increasingly suspicious of them, often asking them whether or not they believed that Hood had really shot himself, to which they always said yes. But he wasn't satisfied, and he wouldn't let either man out of his sight. He began muttering to himself, and he told the 2 of them that he hated white people because one dark winter some had eaten his relatives. After having waited 2 weeks for Franklin to return with the Yellowknives, the men decided that something must have happened to the others and resolved to make the journey themselves to Fort Enterprise. Over the course of the next 2 days, Terre Haute continued his crazed behavior, never sleeping and never leaving the others alone. On the 23rd, they passed by some lichen growing on a rock, and as it had been several days since they had eaten any lichen, Michael stopped to gather it. As he did so, Hepburn and Richardson walked on further, finally stopping when they were out of his sight. Hepburn quietly told Richardson that he would shoot Terre Haute the moment he came close enough, but Richardson told him that he was the senior officer and that he would do it. As Terre Haute walked up to the men, Richardson straightened himself, drew his pistol, and shot him through the head without a moment's hesitation. In the aftermath, Hepburn and Richardson finally said aloud what they'd been thinking, that the wolf meat Terre Haute had given them was really that of another voyageur, and that he was the reason none of the others made it back. He stayed stronger than the rest of them because of his extended trips into the woods, which had really been visits to other men's corpses, carefully cached for when his hunger overcame him. In the midst of a seemingly doomed expedition fraught with death and misery, the two of them had just survived an encounter with a mad cannibal. The summary execution of Michael Terre Haute would go on to cause a deterioration in French and English relations in Canada, but we'll get to that later. In the meantime, you have to imagine these men starving as they slowly watch their comrades die one by one and then left to deal with a madman who had, in all probability, been killing and feeding them the remains of the others. This went on for 2 weeks, and all the while they desperately wondered why no one had returned to rescue them. Well, they set off on the 24th onto an uncertain journey, occasionally finding evidence of the men that had gone before them. On October 29th, they reached Fort Enterprise, and the sight of what they saw there would, as John Hepburn wrote, haunt them for the rest of their lives. The wind comes gusting over you before you realize what's happening. One moment you hear the dry rattling of branches behind you grow from a whisper to a roar. At the next, an Arctic blast sends your swollen feet sliding over the frozen rocks, spilling you onto your back. As you lay gazing up into a sky as desolate as the God-forsaken land you are in, you feel the freezing ground sucking the warmth from your body. You close your eyes and think of how easy it would be to just let it go. It has been 2 weeks since your last good meal, rancid meat from a caribou that had fallen from a cliff. The party had been lucky to find it. Winter has fast settled upon the land, and the caribou have already migrated to the south. With the last of the provisions eaten, you rely on the land to provide nutrients. The best the land has to offer is lichen growing from the frozen rocky surface. When you find it, you boil it with snow water for soup. The texture, like soft, stringy fabric, makes you gag, but you force yourself to swallow it. For when you cannot find lichen, all that's left is the herbal tea that the natives drink. This and the endless cold has left all of you unspeakably weak. There are very few of you now. 4 days ago, you reached the tree line, a place where you could finally build a fire. Many of your disheveled party arrived stumbling, slurring like drunkards, like the other men who had fallen too far behind in the days before. Too dizzy and weak to gather firewood, they sat huddled in their tents as others brought them their ration of tea. That is when the English commander, Franklin, proposed splitting the party in two. The weaker half would remain encamped at the tree line, while the 10 strongest men would march south to that ramshackle encampment the English named Fort Enterprise, and return with meat, friendly Yellowknife Indians. You happen to be amongst the strongest 10, and you are grateful for it, for in your heart you know that with each passing day the winter weather will grow more treacherous, and if you reach Fort Enterprise alive, you may not have the strength to return to camp. You were also grateful because most of the men on the march are voyageurs like yourself, men whose job it was to transport furs over the wild Canadian landscape, where there are no roads or bridges. You are men who know how to travel lean and live off the land, but alas, up here in the Arctic, this is more than wilderness. This is wasteland. You left the camp on October 7th and barely marched 5 miles in the swelling snowdrifts. The next day, Augustus wandered off ahead of you and hasn't been seen since. Then 2 of the men claimed to be too weak to continue and begged to turn back, as did 2 more the next day. Yesterday, the 10th, the 5 of you that remained became so overcome with hunger that you began scorching bits of shoe leather to eat. To think you have survived nearly 30 winters on the North American continent, only for it to all end with you eating your boots. And it will end soon. Each passing day, the party has managed to lose some vital piece of the tent you share each night. Until now, you hardly have enough canvas to craft a windscreen. There is no food, no shelter, and no hope now. These are your thoughts as you lay looking up in the dark, swirling sky, as black flowers bloom in your vision and your life bleeds into the frozen earth. Then, from far away, rising out of the howling wind, you hear it. I can see it, cries Franklin, followed by vaguely excited sounds from the others. Slowly, the black flowers start to fade from your vision, and from head to foot you can feel every nerve ending starting to buzz. Everything begins to look brighter, and a wave of hope comes over you as you ball your gloved hands in a fist and push yourself into a sitting position. The movement is too sudden for your low blood pressure, and contrails fill your vision as you try to make out what's ahead of you. A few moments pass and your vision sharpens a bit, just enough to see the men pushing through the sparse trees far ahead. Gotta get up, you think. Can't get left behind now. You roll onto your left side, and with stupendous effort you force yourself up 1 foot at a time. You push forward slowly but deliberately, taking care not to slip on the abundant ice. Slowly but surely you make your way to the trees. You stop and hug the first one you come to steady yourself as you look ahead again. At first you don't see anyone, and you fight back the sharp and immediate fear that you've lost them. You brace your head and squint past the trees for a long time when you finally see it. The wall. You can see the wall of Fort Enterprise several meters ahead. Your heart begins to race as you push off the tree and take long, lurching strides towards the waiting sanctuary. Images of roaring fires and haunches of venison flood your brain, causing your mouth to water and belly ache with stabbing pangs. As you near, you can hear the men shouting somewhere inside. Yes, yes, you think. Get those savages off of their asses and out here to rescue us. But as you reach the fort's threshold, you notice the base, which should have dozens of hunters and their families inside, is eerily quiet. Your eyes take in the scene, and your first thought is to wonder why no one has cleared the snow nearly thigh-high from the paths between the cabins. And then you look at the cabins themselves, dark, with no smoke coming from the chimneys. Finally, you turn your eyes to the men standing at the porches, hollow-eyed and cursing the Yellowknife leader Acacho. Understanding washes over you. There will be no roaring fires, no haunches of meat, no rum to drink, no rescue. The Indians and the fur companies have given you up for dead, and in a short matter of time, you will be. You sink down to your knees, down into the growing snow, and once again you feel the land sucking your life away. This is it. This is how it ends. You close your eyes, and with surrendered calm, turn your head towards the dark, merciless sky above. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. The fort was in shambles, and aside from Franklin and 3 of the voyageurs, it was otherwise abandoned. Of the group, 1 man was strong enough to walk, and the only reason they were still alive was because they had been eating bones pounded into powder, as well as rotting caribou skins left behind when the fort was abandoned. Abandoned. Why was it abandoned? Where were the Yellowknives, and where was George Back's party for that matter? Franklin told them the sad story of how he and the others had made it back to the fort, only to find it empty with a note left behind from George Back, telling him that he had no idea where the natives were and was going to walk the 140 miles back to Fort Providence. The man who had been the strongest of Franklin's party eventually died, and so it fell to Hepburn and Richardson to care for the survivors. Hepburn was the only one strong enough to walk beyond the fort, and even then, when he attempted to hunt, he was so feeble he could not even raise the rifle to aim. Richardson did what he could for the men still alive. He and Hepburn's limbs were so swollen that they had to cut them to release the built-up fluid enough to move around. He kept a fire burning constantly, feeding it pieces of the fort, as, once again, he was too frail to even walk beyond it. Some of them simply bided their time, waiting for death. Others, like Franklin, took to prayer. In Franklin's journal, he marks the passing of the anniversary of his joining the Navy and laments his hardships. But he remained in constant prayer, pouring out these afflictions to God. He later told anyone who asked that prayer alone is what sustained him through the ordeal. And then one day, November 7th, salvation came. Saint Germain, the Inuit interpreter that had been presumed dead as he had wandered off from the rest weeks earlier, came marching into camp with Acacho and his hunters. They brought with them fresh game, and they enjoyed their first real meal in more than 6 weeks. Acacho and the hunters tended the men's every need, and over the course of the next week they gradually regathered their strength. As wondrous as this coming was, one was left to wonder why they weren't there, waiting for them in the first place. The story came out in bits and pieces, but essentially it boiled down to this. When Acacho left them on the Arctic coast, he well and truly believed that they would die. When he came back to Fort Enterprise, he told the Northwest Company representative Willard Wenzel as much, and so Wenzel had gone back to Fort Providence and did not bother to forward their supplies up to Enterprise. Acacho considered waiting for them, but an unexpected tragedy occurred in his group, in which 3 people had drowned after a canoe capsized. It was evidently their custom to destroy the deceased's belongings in a grief-stricken fury, and to give up hunting and all other activities in the place of mourning. This made his own people's survival difficult, and on top of that, their ammunition had run so low that they were breaking up stone axe heads to use for shot. All this made it a hard season for them, so they packed up and left to focus on making it through the winter themselves. After a week of recovery, they journeyed to Acacho's encampment, with the hunters giving the men their own snowshoes and their first fresh clothing in 3 months. They reached the camp on November 29th, and spent a few days there helping the people to pack up. On December the 1st, the entire group decamped, and they headed south to Fort Providence. At Fort Providence, they parted ways with the Yellowknives, before then being taken to a facility on Moosehead Island in Great Slave Lake to spend what remained of the winter recuperating. It was there that they met George Back and learned of his own harrowing journey to reach the fort. As it turned out, shortly after leaving, one of the voyageurs died from a mix of starvation and exhaustion, bringing the group down to 3. The late historian C. Stuart Houston, a man who wrote a number of books about the expedition based on Hood, Back, and Richardson's journals, believed that Back's party may have resorted to cannibalism themselves, taking meat from the dead voyageur. He notes that in his journal, Back describes them providentially finding decapitated caribou heads whenever they were on the brink of starvation. A rare and strange thing to find more than once on a journey, but even stranger when one considers something that Back said to Willard Wenzel upon their return. "To tell the truth, Wenzel, things have taken place that must not be known." The Englishmen spent the rest of the winter of 1822 composing letters back home as well as outlines of their findings and experiences. There was a good deal of mail that had been collecting for more than a year. Amongst it were letters from John Barrow, promoting Franklin, Back, and the now-deceased Hood. The men also learned that the warring Hudson's Bay Company and Northwestern Company were now one and the same, as the government had forced them into a merger to put an end to the violence. They now operated under the name of the Hudson's Bay Company, and if you so choose, you can still purchase clothing from this more than 350-year-old store. The men were also surprised to be updated on the progress of Captain Perry's new Arctic expedition. Yes, that's right. Captain Perry, whose ship the men had hoped to encounter on the Arctic coast, had already completed his part of the expedition and was already in the midst of a new one. You see, Perry had done tremendously well his first summer out. By the Arctic winter of 1819, he'd made it halfway around Melville Island, which is more or less halfway across the archipelago. No one had ever made it this far west, and in fact he would go on to collect a 5,000-pound reward issued by Parliament for the first man to cross the meridian. But what had stopped Perry from sailing all the way to the Bering Strait was an endless wall of ice more than 42 feet thick. This was highly unusual, as pack ice at the time was typically around 10 feet thick. So Perry took shelter in a bay, and shortly thereafter found himself frozen in for the winter. Fortunately, he had brought along 2 years' worth of provisions, made possible by the fairly recent marvel of canning. This was actually the first expedition in which the majority of the food was canned. The process was not always perfect, as these were hand-soldered cans after all, but the men never faced the hunger that Franklin's party experienced. This is a fantastic little tidbit from Brandt, but he notes in his book that apparently one of these cans was rediscovered in 1942, and somebody opened it up and ate the veal inside. Apparently it was perfectly edible. By the way, if you're into watching people eat old food, there's a YouTube channel called Steve1989 MRE Info, where this guy, Steve, eats and reviews MREs. He's eating some pretty old stuff, so check him out if you want to know what World War II era field rations taste like. Anyhow, when the following Arctic summer came, Perry discovered that there was no way around the colossal pack ice, and so he returned to England. This was an immense accomplishment in which not only were multiple islands discovered and named, but also proof to the Admiralty that modern food and shipping technology could make it possible to navigate and survive in the far north. Perry was rightly hailed as a hero for this and was commissioned to return to the Arctic the following year of 1821, before the other half of the expedition could even be accounted for. On May 26, the men left Great Slave Lake and marched all the way back to York Factory on the coast of Hudson Bay, arriving on July 27th. Along the way from Fort Providence to York Factory, they had to answer some uncomfortable questions from Fur Company's staff, the most uncomfortable of which being the incident with Terre Haute. Questions lingered, especially amongst the French, as to why the situation grew so desperate that men felt the need to resort to cannibalism, and why officers had resorted to an execution without a proper trial. Even Willard Winsell, the man who left them for dead and who undoubtedly deserves blame for at least a few deaths, had the gall to call their actions an unpardonable want of conduct. The fur companies had no respect for the Franklin expedition, which had come so boldly to Canada 4 years before, only to just barely escape with their lives. And of course, not all of them did. 11 had died out on the trail from starvation, exhaustion, hypothermia, and murder. 50 or 60 years ago, there was actually a script discovered in company archives for a skit that lampooned the expedition. It was likely inspired by the stories and gossip from the surviving voyageurs. In early fall of 1822, the Englishmen returned by way of a company ship back to England, arriving in October. One has to wonder what the men expected to return home to on an expedition that took double the amount of time it was supposed to and cost the lives of 11 men, just to map little more than 500 miles of a mostly uninhabited and unnavigable coastline. Well, as it turned out, what awaited them was resounding praise from across Europe. Before the men returned to England, John Barrow got a hold of Franklin's account of the journey and immediately set to work drumming up buzz in London newspapers. He gave carefully edited summaries which played up the heroic struggle of the officers and downplayed the more gruesome parts of the journey. Above all else, he asserted the British people's right to rule across even the world's most remote frontiers by virtue of the robustness of their race. I think that the sentiment is best summed up in this incredibly long sentence that he wrote in a review of the book that Franklin and Barrow himself later wrote of the expedition. He wrote regarding the expedition, quote, "It adds another to the many splendid records of enterprise, zeal, and energy of British seamen, of that cool and intrepid conduct, which never forsakes them on occasions the most trying, that unshaken consistency and perseverance in situations the most arduous, the most distressing, and sometimes the most helpless that can befall human beings. And it furnishes an example of the triumph of mental and moral energy over mere brute strength, in the simple fact that, out of 15 individuals who endured from their birth to cold, fatigue, and hunger, no less than 10 were subdued by the agitation of those evils to which they have been habituated, as to give themselves up to indifference, insubordination, and despair, and finally to sink down and die. Whilst of 5 English seamen, unaccustomed to the severity of the climate and the hardships attending it, only one fell, and he by the murderous hand of an assassin." Unquote. The men were celebrities before they even stepped off the ship. Newspapers and magazines immediately set upon them for interviews, and many a party was held in their honor. For the rest of their lives, perfect strangers would walk up to them on the street and ask to shake their hand, in awe of such men that would selflessly go to the unknown corners of the globe for scientific discovery and the glory of Britain. So what became of the surviving men? Well, Seaman John Hepburn got a proper letter of recommendation from the now Captain John Franklin and found himself promoted and in charge of a small ship in Scotland. Over the years, he kept in contact with Franklin and eventually went with him to Tasmania to serve during Franklin's tenure as governor. He eventually settled into a government appointment in South Africa, where he died in 1864. Second in command John Richardson wrote an account of the adventure in 1823, which towed the line of John Barrow's assertion of the dominance of the British race. It sold out immediately upon its publication, and just 2 years later, it had already begun to appear in the rare book markets. In 1825, he and Franklin returned to Canada for yet another expedition in search of the passage. Richardson did the sailing portion, discovering the Dolphin and Union Strait in his journey, and this time no one died. George Back went on to become a noted explorer, going back to the Arctic to lead 2 of his own expeditions. He went on to serve as an advisor to the Royal Navy until his death in 1878 at the age of 81. He was also something of an artist, illustrating and painting numerous landscapes and scenes from his time in the Arctic. As for John Franklin himself, he went on to have an intriguing life. As I said, after the miseries of the Coppermine Expedition, he returned to the Arctic again after only 3 years, where he successfully mapped 620 miles of coastline between the Kent Peninsula and Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. He married twice to 2 very modern and independent women. After his first wife Eleanor died, only 2 years after contracting tuberculosis, he married her friend Jane Griffin, a wealthy heiress who thought nothing at all about traveling with missionaries down the Nile or trekking to Morocco unescorted. She went with Franklin as he took up positions in Greece and eventually Tasmania. It was at the time known as Van Diemen's Land and was the last labor colony in the British Empire after Britain stopped sending prisoners to Australia. The Franklins' attempts to bring culture to the colony went unappreciated, and after a petty dispute, Franklin was dismissed after serving as its governor for 5 years. The Arctic never strayed far from Franklin's mind, and ever restless after his dismissal, he would eventually persuade his old friend, Sir John Barrow, to let him lead one final search for the Northwest Passage in 1845. Before we round off this episode, I just want to share some closing thoughts on Franklin. I think that he is an easy man to make fun of because of the not swatting mosquitoes or being out of shape or his petulant journaling and overall undeserved confidence in himself. These things may all be true about him, but one cannot discount the fact that he did grow from this expedition. He and the survivors marched halfway across the North American continent and back, many times in the winter, averaging something like 16 miles a day. He was, if nothing else, brave, not just owing to his war experiences, but I think in deciding to return to the Arctic after this veritable journey from hell. And while he was often ill-suited for his assignments, he was never really prone to brag about them. He was remembered as being uncomfortable at parties in his honor, as well as by the adoration heaped upon him by strangers. His humility seemed to come from genuine piety, as he said to the numerous compliments given to him, "Such attention may prompt me to assume individual merit for results which are entirely to be ascribed to the superintending blessing of divine providence." Humility, however, was not a quality of the Admiralty. Over the next 20 years, John Barrow would continue to divert countless resources to his pet project of finding the mythical Northwest Passage, sending dozens of ships and hundreds of men to years of toil and misery. In spite of all signs to the contrary, he would continue to send explorers to the boundaries of the known seas in pursuit of a world almost entirely in his own imagination. That is where we'll leave matters for now, but when we come back in December, we will be checking back with the Sir Johns to see what the culmination of 40 years of diligent searching produced. We will find out if the price of discovery was worth the cost of Franklin's lost expedition. As we wrap up the Coppermine Expedition and open up Ends of the Earth to other journeys, we'd like to thank you for following the story so far. Ends of the Earth will continue in just a few weeks, but we wanted to let you know that there will be another episode of Apocrypha released in the meantime. For anyone unaware, our Apocrypha episodes are supplemental episodes to Grisly History. They consist of a discussion between my producer Michael and I to give greater context to the stories we feature and to break down and otherwise expand on important aspects of the story. So let me pass the question off to you. Are there any topics or parts of the story within the Coppermine Expedition that either we missed or you would just like to hear discussed more? If so, we'd love to hear from you. Please submit any questions, comments, and notes on any of our social media channels, or head on over to grislyhistory.com, click on Contact Us, and drop us a line. We intend to feature your comments within our Apocrypha episode and really hope to build a conversation surrounding these stories we discuss. Regardless, Ends of the Earth will continue in December, picking up the story where we left off. The Coppermine Expedition is truly only the beginning of what would become a century of exploration, discovery, and mystery. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's next. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard thus far, please consider following the show on your preferred podcast player, interacting with our social media channels, and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Your continued support is what is going to shape Grisly History into what it becomes and what it can be. Grisly History is a history podcast hosted by myself, Graham Parker, and produced by Michael Ruiz. For more information on the show, as well as links to our various platforms, please visit our website, grislyhistory.com. Finally, if you have any commercial or narration work that requires a voiceover talent, I am available and I'd love to get in touch with you. Please reach out to my email address, graham@grislyhistory.com, and I'd be happy to talk with you about your upcoming project. Again, that's graham@grislyhistory.com. See you next time.